Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji saibo zagyo jinhanya haramita jishoken gon gai gudo isai gu yaku shari shiki fui gu gu fui.
So today we're going to look at the subject of Zazen, or sitting meditation, which is a subject really up until now we haven't addressed primarily in these talks. And that's often been for a good reason, because Zazen, that is so identifiable that as a practice, one sits down cross-legged in a certain way on a cushion, that it's very easy to forget that a Buddhist practice is much wider than just sitting meditation. And this goes back way before the Zen school. Even though Zen itself means meditation, it doesn't mean that that meditation always takes place sitting down. As the great Yokadaishi points out in his Song of Realization, he says, sitting is Zen, standing is Zen, moving and talking, all are Zen. And this is also reiterated by the 13th century Daito Kokuji as well, the founder of Daitokuji Monastery, in his sermon to the Emperor Hanazono on the original face, where he also points out that although he gives very clear instructions on how to sit Zazen, that we shouldn't think that Zazen is just something that we do on a cushion. But Zazen is important, there's no doubt about it, and it's extremely identifiable as a distinct practice within the Zen school, and a lot of emphasis is placed on it too. Of that there can be little doubt. But it does have to go in harmony with the daily life practice. And it's interesting because when Zen came west, and certainly when it became popularized by such writers as D.T. Suzuki and also Alan Watts, who wrote in the middle part of the last century, they often presented Zen as quite a rational religion. In fact, so rational that there were doubts as to whether this was religion at all. Maybe it was something else, a way of life, philosophy, something like that, for example, because it seemed to do away completely with any sort of supernaturalism, anything that was particularly irrational. And this was a sort of a line that was towed for quite a long time, until more recent times, when people began to question this. Looking at the forms of Zen practice, one could see clearly that there are, very definite religious overtones, and also ritual practices as well. And interestingly, in the 50s, in America at the time of sort of Beat Zen, Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, and so on, again, people were becoming very interested in Buddhism, and particularly in Zen at that time. More latterly, I think it's fair to say that the interest has been more on the Tibetan forms of Buddhism, but at that time Zen was a particularly compelling and potent force for those people who were on the more alternative spiritual paths at that time. And some people wanted to go back to Japan to see how Zen was being taught in its sort of home environment, really. And there were two such quite well known in the US Zen field, who did go back to Japan during this time. And the story goes, as was recounted by one of them, the story goes that they visited quite an ordinary small Zen temple that was run by a priest. He wasn't a great roshi or anything like that. And they asked if they could be shown around, which of course the priest said yes, of course. And as is the usual way, they were initially led to the shrine room. And they were told that this is where the morning services took place, and as the priest walked in, he turned and bowed to the Buddha Rupa that was on the altar there. And then leading them away, they visited the Zendo, and this is where they had a small Zazen group, and people would come and they would sit the formal Zazen. And of course there was an altar there with a Buddha on it as well, to which the priest bowed as he walked past, giving the explanation. And then they went to the community room where there was a small library and people could relax and so forth, whilst they were waiting for the classes to start. And of course there was a little bodhisattva there which he bowed to as he walked past. And they're here with the kitchens and the ablution rooms as well, both of which of course contain their own little icons, to which he did what he always did when he walked past them every day of his life, and he bowed to them. And at one point, one of the visitors couldn't contain himself anymore, having been brought up on the very iconoclastic stories of if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha, and Master Tanka burning the Buddha Rupa on the cold winter's night to keep himself warm. And he exploded, saying, "This bowing and scraping to these idols, I thought Zen was supposed to be above all this. Why," he said, "I could spit at them." And the priest, nodding and in his broken English, said, okay, he says, "You spits, I bows." So actually there was quite a disparity. A number of things could be said about that, but the point to be made here is that there was a disparity really between how that early conception of Zen Buddhism and Zen practice was being given in the West, and really how it was being practiced in its more native environment, where it had obviously put down roots a long time ago. And I remember when I was brought up, I was actually brought up as a Roman Catholic, and for us the central ritual, of course, was the Mass, particularly the Mass on Sunday, which was obligatory for the faithful. And of course the Mass there, depicting, interestingly, not only it wasn't seen, at least not in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, it wasn't seen as mimicry or copying, but an actual enactment of the Last Supper, the transformation of the bread and wine into the transubstantiation, as it were, into the body and blood of Christ, and then that very Christian form of samadhi, the taking into the body, the eating the flesh and the drinking of the blood of Christ, which is an enactment of samadhi, of course. And in Zen, we have Zazen as that central ritual, and if we look at it clearly, there are ritualistic elements to it. We set up a little shrine in our homes. Obviously we set up a mat and a cushion, and if possible we leave it there so that corner of the room becomes associated with the practice of Zazen. Perhaps we light some incense. Before we sit, we bow to the Buddha, and then we sit down quietly and we undertake our Zazen for, say, 2 half-hour periods, something like that, on a regular basis. And this forms our regular Zazen, and every so often we come together and we sit communally, and then periodically throughout the year we might go on a retreat where we sit for a lot longer, obviously. But still, there's a very ritualistic side to it. We go into the Zendo and we bow and we process, and it's very formal. And this is deliberately so because it creates an atmosphere. If you think about it, most people, I mean, if you're not sitting in a temple, but belong to a small Zazen group, and you meet in a church hall or a leisure centre or a friend's meeting house, something like that, well, that room has many different uses throughout the week and throughout the month. But when the meditation group come together, it's formally laid out in a certain way, and that laying the room out in a certain way with a central shrine or altar, and then the cushions being laid out in a certain way and people taking their shoes off and going through these ritualistic processes creates an atmosphere. It's no longer what it was a few days before, where perhaps there was a tabletop sale or a jumble sale or a meeting or something like that. For this particular period, because it's been placed in this particular way, the room takes on a certain aspect, a certain atmosphere, and this atmosphere becomes conducive to the practice that's going to take place in it. And this is the purpose of ritual. Ritual is a symbolic enactment. It's and a symbol is not just a metaphor in spiritual parlance. It actually releases a certain power, and that power, of course, is the associated state of consciousness, which in for our purposes is the state of meditation that arises in that place when we are sitting in it and practicing it in this way. And ritual has been used since the dawn of time by humanity to create these changes in consciousness. And this change in consciousness signifies a change in the way that we perceive things, the way that things are seen. And this very much brings us to the heart of what Zazen is about. Nowadays, there's a great interest in meditation and mindfulness, but particularly meditation. It's a little bit like going to the gym and doing your workout. It's a very specific thing that I use to de-stress and get a little sanity back into my life and so on. And there's nothing wrong with these things, but we mustn't forget that originally Zazen was designed for insight, was practiced for insight, not for de-stressing at all. And so this insight, this way of seeing, is intimately connected with the state of consciousness that sees, and that hears, touches, tastes and smells and cognizes. If that consciousness is very afflicted by an eye-based way of seeing, then everything is split up. We've fallen into that duality, that way of opposites, seeing better and worse, what I like and what I don't like, and everything is related to me. Things are no longer seen in their own right. Things are no longer seen in the round, in themselves. Whereas in the absence of that consciousness that is empty of that mark of self, that delusion of self, as the Buddha called it, that seeing is quite different, and this ritual enactment is designed to enable that transformation in seeing to take place. So it's not just the case that these sort of ritual embellishments, so to speak, are a hangover from a more exotic time, and that they can be dispensed with. We need to really be careful about cutting things down or too much, because we don't understand why they're there. We think they're there for certain cultural reasons only. I mean, they will be there for cultural reasons, obviously, but we think that that's their only function. But that's not the case. Those ritual embellishments are something that gradually we begin to realize, as the whole process of sitting Zazen is a gradual realization, a dawning realization that comes on us. Interestingly, Master Dogen, who was the great Soto Zen Japanese founder, remarked to his monks, asking them the question, why do we sit Zazen? Is it because we want to become Buddhas? In which case, he pointed out, if you look at the Buddha Rupas, they're all sitting in Zazen already. But the question is, if they're Buddhas already, why do they sit Zazen? If all Zazen is a method to enlightenment, a method to attaining Buddhahood. No, he points out, he said, Buddhas sit Zazen, because that is what Buddhas do. And we sit Zazen because we are Buddhas, but have not yet realized it. So it's the same with the whole practice. The practice in its ideal form is what Buddhas do. We think when we undertake the practice that this is something artificial. It's something that I must do, and it doesn't feel particularly natural. But Master Dogen was pointing out that the whole of the Buddhist practice, not just the sitting Zazen, but the whole of the Buddhist practice is something that Buddhas do anyway. And because our basic nature is Buddha, this is why we do it. This is why it becomes our practice. And Zazen is obviously a very important element of that. So before we really have even looked at the mechanics of Zazen, it's important to place it in some kind of context. We need to be clear what it is that we are actually setting about doing. And a useful thing as well to keep in mind, because very easily the practice of Zazen can fall back onto me and onto I doing for my benefit and so forth. And actually the benefit of Zazen is incurred when I am out of the way, when I am given away. And this is why we always have an object of meditation, and it's usually the breath, or putting a count on the breath, and we give ourselves into that object away. We give ourselves away, because in the act of giving myself away into that object, then the state of meditation will arise as a consequence of that being given away. So it is never I doing meditation. Whilst I am there, no meditation state can arise. Once I am given away, then the state of meditation arises as a natural consequence of that. The smooth consciousness without the severing into subject, object, self and other arises quite naturally. It simply reverts back to that primal state before thinking of good and bad, as the sixth patriarch said. So, having now established why we're sitting, now we can move a little bit on to the mechanics of it per se. So the first thing that we set up, of course, is the body. And the setting up of the body is extremely important. We might think or consider that meditation is essentially a mental practice, but it's not. It's a physical practice. It is almost entirely somatic, and there's a reason for this. If we reflect about onto our sort of inner landscape, so to speak, we are no doubt aware that our minds are full of all sorts of thoughts, and we have moods and emotional reactions to things, and hopes and fears and so forth. We're very aware of those things. But we may also be aware that all this is arising in the context of our own physical form. And when I talk about the physical form, it's not just the physical matter itself, but the consciousness of the physical form. And of course we are all, or we can all be conscious. It's one of the four foundations of awareness. The first one is known as rupa, which is the conscious awareness of the physical form and what it is doing. And this is cultivated, and the reason for this is quite simple. If I pinch myself in the arm, and maybe just as I'm talking right now, do it. Just give yourself a few pinches in the arm. Now ask yourself, do you have to think, yes, a pinch, in order to feel that pinch? Or does that pinch arise quite of itself, quite independent of my thought, straight into conscious awareness? Surely it's the latter, hopefully. I don't have to think. I don't have to, as it were, consciously think into existence physical sensations. And it's the same, for example, if we just note briefly the pressure of one's backside on the seat, or one's feet on the floor, or what the hands are doing, the shape and the position of the hands. Or maybe if we're really paying attention, the sensation of the clothes against our skin on the chest, shoulders and back. all this can be taken in, and although they will arise into consciousness as I'm actually suggesting, as I'm actually narrating, the sensations themselves are not dependent on having to think about them. They arise, and obviously if a very strong physical sense stimulus appears, such as I trap my finger in the door, then that jumps directly into consciousness and throws everything out all in one instant. So the reason that we use the body so much in our practice, and certainly as an object of meditation, is because there is no thinking in it. And our preponderance of thinking is part of the problem, that I spend so much of the time with that inner sports commentator and with that inner video film playing, that the body's doing one thing, going down the street or taking objects off the supermarket shelves or sitting on a bus, whilst the mind has to be preoccupied in something else, either its own thoughts or on a game on my phone or in a book or something like that. So consciousness is invariably being split in two for most of the time, and it's trying to smooth that out and unify that, which is, of course, what samadhi is, sometimes referred to as oneness. But samadhi literally means joining together two things that have come apart or gone astray. So that physical body, and this is why the setting up of the physical form is important, because actually not only does the mental body arise within the physical one, it's also extremely closely connected to it and affected by it. If I come in and collapse into my armchair and really sort of and slump over, it doesn't take long before a sort of lethargy overcomes me. You know, I can't be bothered. I'm supposed to get up now and make the meal or clear away some things, and the more I sit in that sort of slumped and hunched over state, the more I feel I really cannot be bothered, and that mood can take hold of me. And if we then just pull ourselves up and make the spine erect and straight, and pull the head up and the chin in a little bit and the shoulders back, and relax the midriff, then suddenly that mood vanishes like the morning mist in bright sunlight, and there is some energy there, and it makes it a lot easier then to get up and continue on once that mood has been dispelled. And this is why in Zazen we have particular forms. We sit in a particular way. And ideally we need that good firm foundation that's usually made up of a triangle with 3 points on the ground, either the backside and the two knees, which is done either sitting cross-legged or by kneeling with the knees apart and with a cushion underneath the backside, or if sitting on a chair, with the backside and the 2 feet, which should be apart and flat on the ground. And for those who are very tall, you may need to put an extra cushion on the chair so that one's hips are slightly above the knees. This encourages the hips to the pelvis bone to tip forward and allows the back to form that nice natural S-shaped curve, which is very important, and which is why those sitting on a cushion will sit on a zafu or zabuton, which will raise the buttocks above the knees. As long as the buttocks are above the knees, then the pelvis bone tips forward and the back takes on quite a natural shape. And this means that I'm not constantly pulling myself up in order to sit up straight. We can relax or relax the torso, and the S-shaped spine is maintained. The shoulders are back but not pushed back, so the chest is open and the stomach is relaxed, and that relaxing of the stomach allows the center of gravity to sink down. Ideally the heart should be below the navel, in what's known as the hara, or sometimes, or in Chinese as the tanden. We don't have to be too precise about that, but certainly that the center of gravity should be felt to be low down in the body, rather than attention always being up with the thoughts. So with that, then the hands are usually together and supported in the lap, and the head is upright, facing forward, with the chin pulled in, the mouth closed. Traditionally, the teeth are together, not clenched, and the tongue is touching the back upper teeth, or just resting on the upper palate. And the breathing is in and out through the nose. And the breathing is just the normal breath, the natural breath. With we don't try and I do not impose my will on the breath. This is important. The translation, which is quite a good one into English parlance, is for this form of meditation is called following the breath, and it's following the breath with a connotation that the breath leads and I follow by giving myself into that lead, instead of imposing my will on it and counting in for 4 and holding for 4 and so on, as some practices have it. Those are different practices. In Zazen, the breath is autonomous and is allowed to be the leader, and I simply follow and give myself into that. And for half a dozen breath cycles, just enough to notice the breath coming in and out. Need to do nothing more than that. And then after that, in particular, begin to notice the out breath. And quite useful, noticing with that out breath that there's a slight sinking sensation, rather like when we sigh. Another useful analogy, getting into a hot bath on a cold day. And that sinking sensation, that physical sensation of that sinking, we give ourselves into that. 1, 2, 3. With each out breath, taking us a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper into the body, and a little bit deeper, without allowing the form of the body to collapse, please, but the heart itself, in other words, the focus of attention, begins to sink away from the busy thoughts and down deeper into the quiet spaciousness of the body space. And naturally enough, thoughts come in and carry me away, and this is why we put that count on the out breath, 1, because it's one thought at least that preoccupies. Now, the important thing about this is 2 things really to keep in mind. One is that we will find that it becomes a sort of habitual practice, and it's possible to count the out breath and be thinking about other things at the same time. This is not Zazen. This is why that giving of myself, which is why we use that physical sinking sensation, has to be wholehearted. And to help us do that, that count goes right to the very end of the out breath, where it is completely expired. 1, 2. And if we do not turn the attention back before the breath has fully exhaled, but go right to the very end, we become aware that at that end point there is a drop-off. There is a drop-off and an opening out into something that's quiet and very spacious. And our practice is simply the cultivation of that deep familiarity, of that quiet spaciousness, so that even when we're not on the cushion, it has become so familiar that we can come back to it during the ordinary day, at certain moments when we recall. Perhaps we're standing waiting for a lift, or in a queue, or just taking a moment to stop and just return once again, sinking deep into that quiet spaciousness and opening out. And that opening out is not something that I do. If there's any feeling of I still there, then again, 1 needs to go that little bit deeper in that way. And in this way, that state, that openness, that a consciousness that is not preoccupied, focused narrowly on I, me and mine, begins to take in more information from both its outer surroundings and also from the body itself, which is a great source of wisdom, and picks things up a lot quicker than I do. And that information then shows us a little bit more in the round the circumstances, the way things really are. And in this way, Zazen and daily life practice really do come together and can be seen in the end as, in fact, one and the same practice. But that ritual basis reminds us that, in fact, this is something that goes beyond I, and takes us into something, into a world that is that is bigger than I imagined, and also more profound. Okay, we'll leave it there.